Okay, let's begin. So first of all, welcome to today's CCPL talk on the important topic of where does U.S. China scholarly exchange go from here. And I'm Sida Liu, I'm the director of CCPL, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my longtime friend and also a longtime friend of our law school, Nathan Mabubi, to give this talk. So Nathan is currently the director of the PEN project on the future of U.S.-China relations at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is a relatively new project, the PEN project. And before he became the director for this project, for many years, Nathan actually worked at UPenn as the research scholar of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And he's still involved in the center. And also, as some of you might know, that Nathan is a social media celebrity among the scholars of Chinese law. He runs a very popular podcast. He also is a frequent commentator in many foreign and Chinese media, including the CGTN. But of course, he's not just a social media celebrity. Nathan is also an expert on administrative law, comparative law, and Chinese law, especially Chinese administrative law. As a matter of fact, ever since he was the undergraduate student at Princeton, he actually already visited Beijing, befriended a group of Beida law professors that, I never really had got a chance to meet as a Beida law graduate. And he has been doing research continuously on administrative law in China for the past two decades, right? So, currently, I think Nathan is also a visiting scholar at Peking University Beida Law School in January this year. But today, he's not going to talk about administrative law. He's going to talk about a much more important and timely topic, which is U.S.-China scholarly exchange. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Nathan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That was one of the most kind and generous introductions I think I've ever had. So hopefully I can have you come and introduce me anytime I talk. The only quibble I have with Sida's introduction is that I don't think there's any topic that's more important than administrative law. So this is still secondary importance, but I'm very happy to be with all of you today to talk about the path forward for U.S.-China academic exchange. It's really special for me to be back here. The last time I was here was exactly 5 years ago, January 2019. I have so many close friends here. Of course, Sida I've known a very long time. We are colleagues on the standing committee of the Zhengfa Way. If you don't know what that means, if it sounds odd, I'll just encourage you to Google it. I'll do some guerrilla marketing. You can Google it and see what exactly that means. But of course, Susan Finder, I've known many, many years. When I first started writing about administrative litigation in China, one of the very first things I read was her piece in the 1980s in the Columbia Journal of Chinese Law. Albert, I always tell everybody that the single best one-volume introduction to Chinese law is his book, An Introduction to Chinese Law, which is very hard to find, unfortunately, but it is the best volume for English language readers. So I always recommend it. And of course, Angela and Jed and Wang Yuezhan. And I'm so honored that Li Cheng is here, who I've known for many years. We are both students of Lynn White, and I'm so happy that he's here. And I got to see him in action at Jacques' talk yesterday. So anyway, it's very, very special for me to be here. When I came in January 2019, I subsequently, in April 2019, had a chance to record an episode of the podcast that I still host, the CSTC podcast, with Johannes Chan, who was, of course, the former dean of the law school here, on the rule of law in Hong Kong. Most podcasts are usually about half an hour long. My podcast often is longer, often an hour and a half. That conversation with Johannes lasted 5 hours. We talked about the history of Hong Kong, the history of the legal system in Hong Kong, everything that led up to that moment of our conversation in April 2019. I released it in 2 parts because it was such a long conversation. And those 2 episodes remain among the top 4 most downloaded episodes ever of that podcast. So I always think very warmly about that conversation and Johannes. I come to you today from Beijing, where I am, as Siddha noted, a visiting scholar at Peking University Law School, a place where I have had a lot of very warm ties for many decades. And I come to you having just organized, under the auspices of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations, a conference, a 2-day conference in Beijing, involving both U.S. and Chinese experts, talking in a very, very, I think, specific, frank, robust way about different areas of interest in the U.S.-China relationship, including technology, environment, trade, national security, law and human rights, research and education. I think it is probably the most substantive in-person exchange between U.S. and Chinese scholars in China since the pandemic. I know there have been some other meetings in the past few months since China reopened after the COVID restrictions came down, but I don't honestly think there was anything quite as detailed and substantive and in the weeds as our meeting. And we were all thrilled by that, both myself and my Chinese co-sponsors of the conference, and all the participants, both on the US and Chinese side, were very, very, very pleased by the quality of the conversation. And so I come with a little bit of optimism about the future of U.S.-China academic exchange based on that experience. But of course, that comes against the backdrop of a very difficult time. And so I do want to be respectful of why it's been a difficult time and to talk about the things that have led to that, but then maybe also chart some ideas about how we can go forward that are informed by the fact that I just did experience something that felt like it would have been impossible, just a couple of years ago. Of course, not impossible against the broad backdrop of the U.S.-China relationship, but the kind of thing that has become very, very difficult in recent years. Now, it has become difficult. I think all of us are very familiar with this because there is the backdrop of increasing tension between the U.S. and China, increasing, we often talk about it in terms of geopolitical conflict. But the pandemic took whatever kind of issues we were having with U.S.-China academic exchange in the period around 2019 and just sort of took it off a cliff. So I'm very comfortable with blaming the pandemic for having really, really had an enormously detrimental effect on the landscape of U.S.-China academic exchange. But of course, it's not the only factor. It was something that accelerated dynamics that were already in play because of the underlying U.S.-China tensions. And I think we should be very realistic that those tensions are not going away anytime soon. They're likely to be persistent for the near future and will continue to complicate the landscape of U.S.-China academic exchange. I have cared a lot about this particular issue. It's probably, Siddha was kind to say that I have some degree of social capital and public discourse. And the particular issue that I have really focused on has been the importance of preserving the space for academic exchange, and to define it, to have students from China continue to go to the U.S. to study, to have students from the U.S. to come to China, and of course Hong Kong to study, to have scholars go back and forth to visit at each other's institutions, to have academic meetings, to have joint research projects. This is what I'm talking about when I emphasize the landscape of academic exchange. It's different, I believe, from what is sometimes termed track 2 dialogues. There was just, for those of you who read The Wire China, there was just a long story in that by Bob Davis, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, about the prevalence of track 2 dialogues now that often involve U.S. and Chinese experts talking about issues that are of friction in the U.S.-China relationship in a way that is sort of reflective of maybe official positions in both countries, and that are then somehow reported back to relevant decision makers in a way that everyone wants them to be. That's its own thing, and I don't have anything at all positive or negative to say about that. I think that's perfectly fine, but I don't think that's what academic exchange is about. Academic exchange is not principally in the service of reporting policy perspectives to decision makers in the two countries. Academic exchange is really perfectly in line with our mission as students and scholars at our respective institutions at whatever stage of our academic careers we're in, of inquiry, of trying to better understand whatever is the target of our study, whether it be a country, an issue, a perspective. And the idea of academic exchange has always been that through conversation, through collaboration, through joint research, through joint conferences, through students going back and forth, we can have a deeper understanding of issues. I have always felt very conscious of the importance of this kind of dynamic because of my own history that Siddha was kind enough to allude to, where at a very early age, when I just was starting to study China, when I was just starting to be interested in Chinese law, I had the opportunity to meet actually Professor Jiang Ping, who you will all know recently passed away and was one of the most incredible figures in the development of modern Chinese law. I got to meet him in New York because he was a visiting scholar in New York at Columbia Law School. I was an undergraduate, but I was able to meet him there. He told me that he would be very happy to introduce me to scholars in China if I were able to go there. And he's the one who selected my research topic. Jiang Ping suggested that I study administrative litigation in China. I didn't know at the time, but found out later that he'd been the chair of the drafting committee, the scholars' drafting committee for the administrative litigation law. And so that's how I, end up being here. That's my story. And of course, that interaction with Jiang Ping was built on an entire edifice that many others, including people like Susan and Albert, had built up to that point. That edifice included lots of different things, but one focal point for it was the Committee for Legal Education Exchange with China, a project that had been supported by the Ford Foundation that ran from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, in which hundreds of really promising Chinese legal scholars were able to go to the United States to study in different law schools. Some of them got degrees, some of them were visiting scholars, and an incredibly large number of them went back to China and took up different positions in the Chinese legal system. Some professors, some went into the government. So that was not something that Jiang Ping personally did, but it's reflective of that era of the 1980s and 1990s, where there was all of this back and forth. There were, as you went through the 1990s, there were increasingly large-scale programs where American judges would come to China, Chinese judges would go to the United States. They would understand how adjudication was handled in their respective countries. There were joint research projects. There were joint publications. There was this entire world that I was able to kind of just, as a 19-year-old, just kind of surf on because it had already been built up by other people. And so when I started going to China in the 1990s, it was very easy to meet all these people who had already been in touch with my professors back in the United States. So I felt very viscerally the way in which, at least in the area of law, academic exchange between the U.S. and China had been built up. And so this has been very deeply, I've always understood it to be the way in which my understanding of China has proceeded and the community with which I've been plugged in. And so when the pandemic brought an end to all of these dynamics, when it became impossible to come back to China to study Chinese law, to talk to my longtime interlocutors, I felt it very, very deeply. So this has been the issue that I've been very public about because I've understood the history and I've experienced it myself, and I've thought throughout that understanding of the issues that I study is essentially impossible without being able to go and have the kinds of conversations I've had in China over many, many years. That's why I've been so active on this point. Of course, many others feel this way as well. And we are at a moment now where the broader landscape has turned out to be so grim that there are other people who are very actively promoting the revival of these dynamics of exchange. And those people include leadership in both countries. We're increasingly hearing concerns from the Chinese government about the very low number of American students that are studying in China now. Of course, we've all heard the statistic that 2 years ago, there were only 350 American students in China against the backdrop of just, maybe 10 years ago, there were some thousands, maybe as many as 11,000 American students studying in China. That number is very depressing. Now, of course, the number has gone up since 2 years ago. It's no longer just 350, but it still seems to be about under 1,000. Most of those students are at programs like Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University and NYU Shanghai and the Peking University Yenching Academy. So there's nothing like the broad range of American students throughout China that we had seen before. There are Chinese students still going to the U.S., but we are all quite familiar, I think, with the challenges that Chinese students are facing in getting visas, and sometimes being aggressively questioned at the border. Some of those cases are being disseminated widely on Chinese social media, as they should be. And we understand that is having a chilling effect. Scholars are very reluctant on both sides, I think, to continue the kinds of in-person exchanges that we've experienced in the past. I'm thrilled to see that there's so many American colleagues and Western colleagues who are at this campus, Hong Kong University, these few days. I think is an incredibly promising sign. Of course, Hong Kong is a special case. It's not reflective of the dynamics within China itself entirely. So as promising as that is, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of getting American scholars willing to start going back to China. And Chinese scholars, again, because of the visa issues and maybe some other political concerns, are reluctant to go back to the U.S. So even though the pandemic restrictions have subsided, we still are in this moment where those dynamics of exchange are still very, very, very weak. That's something that I think both governments recognize. So as I said, when you look at the rhetoric that came out of the Sunnyland Summit between Presidents Biden and Xi, there was, I think, very clear language in both readouts about the importance of scholarly exchange. You had the statement from President Xi about having some 50,000 American students go back to study in China. Increasingly, if you pay attention to the rhetoric from U.S. policymakers, including people like Ambassador Nick Burns, they're emphasizing the importance of American students going back to China. I've heard him speak a number of times recently, and in both cases, Ambassador Burns talks about how it is in America's national interest for there to be better understanding of China and for students from the States to go to China to study. So, there is some space now that maybe those of us who care about this issue can take advantage of to start to restart these old dynamics. But we're going to have to work on it. It's not something that's going to happen naturally. And there's still a lot of challenges in the picture, even if we can say that there's some more supportive rhetoric coming from both governments. Let me list some of those challenges that still remain despite the more positive atmosphere from the rhetoric from the two governments, and then chart out some of my own ideas for how we can navigate those. And then, of course, I'd love to hear all of your perspectives and have an open conversation. Among the challenges are very core, basic logistical things like flights. We all know that is part of the picture, that we are no longer able to just jump on a plane and go direct from Newark or JFK as easily and come to China, or the reverse. That is something that I think both governments are aware of, and they're kind of moving towards finding some way forward. But there's a lot of complexity to that. So that very, very non-scholarly issue is still part of the picture. The visa issue is a huge deal. I think that one of the big frustrations that many people like myself have with the rhetoric from the American policymakers is that they do say that we want to encourage these dynamics of exchange, but they do not seem at all to be interested in being responsive to our concerns, scholars who are pushing to restart exchange. They're not that interested in being responsive to our concerns that there's over scrutiny of Chinese students and scholars going to the United States, and that has an enormous chilling effect. They just are not responsive. And, I think it's very frustrating for those of us who think that that is a big part of this picture, for them not to see that. In terms of when we think about American students coming to China or American scholars coming to China, one of the depressing factors is the ongoing State Department travel advisory. There's still a level 3 travel advisory. Again, we don't see any movement on that. So, it's one thing to go around and say we want to have more American students go to China because it's in our national interest. But if you don't remove the travel advisory, then parents are going to tell their kids, don't go to China because it's unsafe. Or scholars will say, I can't go to China because it's unsafe. So, there's very clear things that are still in the picture on the American side. And on the Chinese side, we also have very, very clear examples of American scholars, often of Chinese descent, coming to China to visit family or to conduct research and being stopped at the border, aggressively questioned, sometimes not allowed into the country. So that's a reciprocal dynamic. Both governments are doing it. And it's very clear that the political atmosphere in China is still not fully ready for full-fledged exchange. There is, I think, a clear understanding at the very top leadership that it's a problem that there aren't more foreigners currently in China, and that especially foreign students and scholars not being there is a problem. But I don't think there's yet full acceptance of what that exchange will look like if it were to restart. I think there is still some ongoing feeling that if there is exchange, it should be exchange that tells China's story well, and that is sort of structured and careful and with approved partners and approved topics and safe discussion. That's not academic exchange. That's something else. And maybe it has its own kind of value, but academic exchange is critical. It's deep, it's detailed. It is not beholden to any kind of guardrails around what we can talk about. And so I think that's the kind of thing that I think on the Chinese side, especially if, it's sort of a two-player game. If the Americans are able to get over some of the issues that are keeping them from encouraging our students and scholars to come to China, then we're going to put more pressure on the Chinese side to actually see if they're willing to have the open and robust and frank kinds of discussions that we have had in the past, but we haven't had in person since the pandemic. All of this is very complicated, but I do think that there are some indications that we have some room to move forward here. Again, I just had this experience of putting this conference together that worked. It was exactly the kind of academic exchange that I've experienced in the past. It came, at a moment where tension still remains, but there wasn't, any way in which our conference was impacted by those tensions in a negative way. And so I think, there's some space there. And so among, I think, the checklist items that I think went into helping that conference be a success, and that I can maybe suggest are a way of a playbook for all of us who care about these dynamics to encourage them further in this moment that we have, where we have a little bit of space to push it forward. Those include things like having practical wisdom, thinking carefully about how to structure dynamics. The conference that we just did in Beijing was a co-sponsored conference that was very, very helpful. We were very, I think, intentional about the decisions we made to structure that in a productive way. We also all, me, my co-sponsor, our participants, had to accept some level of risk. This is a risky environment. You cannot approach this as a no-risk environment. And that is something that I think maybe is hard for academics in particular sometimes to accept a no-risk environment, or they would prefer a no-risk environment. So it's a little hard to accept that there's some degree of risk, but I think it was an acceptable degree of risk. It was a risk that did not go beyond sort of what is reasonable in some broad sense to take on. But you have to be comfortable with that. This is not completely straightforward in the way it may have been 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It is much more reminiscent of the period in the immediate aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, when reform and opening was just opening up, and you were just starting to have these dynamics of exchange. And a lot of the Chinese and American scholars at the time had to be comfortable with a degree of risk. And so I think, if we want these things to go forward, we will have to be comfortable with some degree of risk. We will have to get out of the patterns that we've all become accustomed to because of the dynamics of COVID, in the same way that many of us maybe didn't go to restaurants or movies for some years under COVID, and it was a little bit difficult to get back into the dynamic of those things. In the same way, boarding a flight, flying not only 13 hours now, but maybe 24 hours in 2 steps, it takes some initiative to do that. That's, again, especially academics are not always great at getting out of their comfort zone once they're in a routine. And when you get to the other place, there are things that will have changed that you just have to get a little bit used to. This is especially a problem for American academics who are coming back to China right now, where the entire landscape of how you just navigate daily life in China has changed. So, many of my friends in the American academic community have for decades been very familiar with how to navigate daily life in China in a very particular way. That way does not exist anymore. You cannot spend cash anymore. You have to do digital payments. You can't call people. You have to use WeChat, right? These are very kind of basic daily life kinds of things, but they're essential for people to get used to if we want to get the dynamics of in-person exchange. And I think, I guess I don't have as good examples or that on the Chinese side going back to the States, but we do know that there's reluctance from Chinese scholars to go back to the United States. Even, I would say, the visa issues are not the only thing. One of the points that I think comes up a lot in conversation with Chinese scholars who are concerned about going back to the United States, and that often comes up in conversations about Chinese students going back to the United States, is this perception that the United States has become an apocalyptic wasteland of guns and violence and drugs, and that it's completely unsafe to do anything at any time. Of course, I often talk about this point to mention that many of the things that people are concerned about obviously happen and are reported on, but they do not define the totality of lived experience in the United States. So when I'm walking from, my apartment in Philadelphia to the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, I do not feel under siege that I'm suddenly going to be attacked by zombies and fire and all of this. So there is some conceptual hurdle for Chinese scholars to get over as well. These, I think, are all doable. This is why I think, even though I'm clear about the reasons why the dynamics of exchange have not really gotten restarted quite yet fully, I think these are all solvable issues. They're all things that we can push through. And given that we do have this moment right now where the two governments are, at least rhetorically, giving us space to restart dynamics of exchange, I feel strongly that we should take it. We don't know how long this moment will last. There's lots of things that can potentially complicate the U.S. China relationship at any given moment, things that we can expect and other things we can't expect. At any given moment, we might look up and there's a balloon in the sky, and that balloon will completely mess up U.S. China relations for the next 6 months. We don't know. Any of that can happen at any given moment. But as long as we have this window of opportunity now, I think it's important to take advantage of it. Let me say one other additional thing, because a lot of what I've talked about to you here has been broadly about the U.S. and China, and maybe especially with a focus on mainland China. But I think Hong Kong, in particular, is a really important node in this overall story. And I want to emphasize a few points about that before closing and opening up to your questions and comments. Historically, Hong Kong has always been a place where some of the more difficult dynamics between the U.S. and China could be solved in a sense, and that's certainly true in business, but it's also been true in academic exchange. For many, many years, this was a place where the kinds of conversations that would be much harder to do within China were able to be done here. And I think that has continued, as far as I can tell, even through the pandemic, for quite a bit of time. Meetings that were completely impossible to hold within China because of the pandemic restrictions, but also because of sensitivities were being held here in Hong Kong. Now that people like me are pushing for those types of meetings to continue to happen in China, in mainland China, it opens the question of then what is the role of Hong Kong going forward? And to me, I think Hong Kong has to be the vanguard for all of the dynamics that I've talked about. Hong Kong has to keep pushing the line on this stuff. It can't be just the place where the kinds of things that happen in China also happen here. It has to be the place where it might not entirely work in China, can happen here, because Hong Kong still has this special status. And so just walking through campus the past 24 hours and seeing the incredible number of talks by this incredible number of people at all hours on all topics has given me a lot of hope that Hong Kong can continue to play that role. And I hope it does, understanding that there is this broader dynamic of the U.S. and China academic exchange that I hope we can contribute to and make positive contributions to. Okay, so I think that's it that I want to say for now, but I know there's a lot of people in the room have very important and thoughtful things to say about this topic, and so I'm very curious to hear from you and to have an open discussion.
Thank you, Nathan. So, as the chair, I want to take my privilege to ask the first question. I usually don't do that, but I really want to ask the first question this time because I'm curious about the PEM project. Because since, especially now you're the director of the PEM project on the future of U.S. China relations, I think I'll stop calling you Nathan or Mr. Mabubi. I'll call you Ma Zhuren from now on. For those who don't know,
it's very helpful in China. I will say that. Yes. Having the director title is helpful in China.
Yes. So for those who don't know this, Nathan has a beautiful Chinese name, Ma Rui Xin. So as Ma Zhuren, what is this PEM project is about? And as the director of the project, what things do you have in mind?
Yeah, so basically the basic fundamental idea of the PEM Project, Future of U.S.-China Relations, is that we can contribute to U.S.-China policy discourse in the United States in particular by elevating the perspectives of next generation scholars and experts in the United States who have new and maybe more specialized research that can be the source of new policy ideas. So we had an initial class of fellows that we convened a few years ago when the project was still under the auspices of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And then we just put out a call for applications for a new class of fellows. Those applications are due at the end of the month. And in February, we'll have a new class of fellows across the 6 topic areas covered by the project, which include national security, trade, human rights, environment, technology, research and education. And over the course of this next year, the second class of fellows will be encouraged to turn their very specialized research into different dynamics in China into policy recommendations for U.S. policymakers. What we're trying to do with this project is to introduce into the policy discourse expertise of a new vintage. So it's both trying to get a policy discourse in the U.S. that unfortunately does not often take expertise seriously, to maybe look at expertise that has been cultivated specifically to better speak to policymakers, and then maybe to look at some new voices that have not been necessarily as active in this U.S.-China policy discourse before. As part of that process of cultivating this new class of fellows and eventually leading to policy briefing at the end of the cycle of the fellowship, we will then bring the fellows to China to have a similar meeting like the one that we just held a few days ago in Beijing, to have a dialogue with Chinese counterparts. And one of the things that I'm excited about is that dialogue will be with Chinese counterparts who are also next generation scholars and experts. So we are trying to basically bring new groups of younger people together to have a discussion that is not meant to reach common ground necessarily, but is meant to at least inform each other with specialized knowledge, and then the two sides can go back and potentially speak to their policy discourse informed by the interactions that they've had. So that's essentially the model of the PEM project. The other thing about it that I think is important to emphasize, which goes back to your earlier point about social media and podcasts and things like that is, in general, even if you take away the next generation component, I do think we are at this moment in the U.S. China discourse in particular, where those of us who are in the academic world really do need to think a lot about a responsibility to speak beyond just our own specialized audiences and share whatever expertise we may have in our specialized world with the wider discourse. I think we did not often do that in the past. I didn't, certainly. My core audience still remains the 10 people who really want to know about the most, detailed aspects of Chinese administrative litigation that I find interesting. And that's still obviously important for all of us as scholars to think about that primary audience for our core academic work. But given the wider landscape that shapes the world we live in, I think we just have to think more also about speaking to wider audiences. And to be effective in speaking to wider audiences, I think means partly meeting them where they are, and not necessarily thinking that we can take our journal articles and just put it in front of them and they will read it and take the necessary takeaway points. So the Penn Project, I think, has that component as well, in that we will amplify the perspectives of the people involved in the project, so things like podcasts and webinars, shorter form essays, all the kinds of things that I think are very useful for translating academic insights that are honed in really serious academic settings into a language that can be more effective in the wider discussion. And I think that that's something that potentially can be useful for Chinese to think about as well, as they think about the policy discourse within China about the United States. I think certainly many of you will be aware that the social media environment in China right now is extraordinarily toxic, right? So there's a television presenter in Hainan who had the temerity to say that, well, he did have the temerity to say that that the earthquake in Japan was somehow deserved. And when he was suspended by the television station for saying something truly offensive, all the netizens got together and, have been for some time now accusing the television station of being an agent of the Japanese government, because what the television presenter said was, of course, correct. This is a very, very toxic social media environment in China as well. And so, how do you address that? I don't know, within the Chinese context, maybe a little bit different than what I'm sort of more clear about in the US context. But those of us who I think have more nuanced understanding of issues should try to think about how we can get our voices into that space if we can. Certainly, I think that we have some degree of responsibility to do that. And to kind of close the point, that's partly the kind of approach the Penn Project represents.
I totally agree on the last point about social media. And also, I think the project is actually very exciting. I certainly hope it's successful. So with that, I think we'll open up for questions. Yes, Jack, please.
We're sort of mid-career. And so we have sort of choices.
Young at heart, always young at heart.
So we have choices about things like risk, right?
Yeah.
We have networks, we have people. So I want to put to you what seems to be the most difficult conversation. Just one says, like, I have a young student in the U.S. and they're thinking about whether or not they want to pursue research.
Yeah.
And one thing is conversation. Let's say that person's a historian or an anthropologist or a sociologist, where they would actually have to go to China and do empirical research. And they have to think about risk and their career. Right? They're no longer likely to think that they may have an academic career in China, but in the US. And when those conversations about risk, difficult conversations saying you should choose this specialization. And it's a little bit sort of tempting to say, like, maybe it's safer, right, to talk about, well, if you're interested in China, talk about like China in someplace.
Yeah.
It's not going to require you to actually go to China. So, or just another specialization. So this is someone who's 20, 21 years old, right? They're at that point where they really have to commit to language study, all these types of investment, right? Where the risk really is part of that particular calculus, which, when you're a tenured professor or you're mid in your career, you don't have to worry about those things so much. So in that type of context, how do you talk about risks?
Yeah.
Making those?
I mean, that's a fantastic question, and one that I've had very deep and systematic conversations with some of our colleagues in the U.S. about. I think I can accurately report that people are much more confused about what is the right advice for graduate students than for undergraduates. I think, roughly speaking, most sort of mid-career scholars of China in the US, I think, are fairly comfortable saying that it is a big problem that undergraduates are not studying China, are not coming to China, studying Chinese language, and that we should be thinking about all sorts of creative ways to encourage that. Rory Truex just published this piece in the Washington Post that I think really was focused on the whole picture, but he had some very good points about undergraduate education and interest. And some of the risks that you're alluding to are a little less with that group. When you get to graduate students, then we get to the landscape that I think you're very, very nicely laying out. And I think there's a lot of varied opinions about that. There's some topics that are going to be a lot harder for a graduate student to pursue, especially if you're thinking about in-person field work, than was the case when you and I were coming up, or people before us. And they are also hurt by the fact that they haven't built up the social understanding of how to navigate tricky situations. So I think there are some very, important scholars of China who are very hesitant to suggest that their graduate students come back to China to do field work because they really don't think that the risk can be managed well. I think that will be an ongoing conversation. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think it's easier to think, well, at least let's get the pipeline going again, because many of the graduate students that we're talking about did at least get to that point. They are the legacy of an earlier period where there was more undergraduate interest, and maybe having that pipeline come to an end is a problem we can all agree on. Let's get the pipeline going again, but it does eventually come to the same problem of how do you correctly advise, and it doesn't have to be necessarily just graduate students, young professionals who might be thinking of a legal career or a banking career. How can you advise them to put themselves in a situation that is going to be risky? I think I feel most comfortable saying that for those of us who are well familiar with this landscape, that risk we should be able for ourselves. I'm very encouraging of scholars of our generation to restart the dynamics that we are used to. That I think we can handle those risks and we can be wise about them. But that's a very complicated for how to best advise the students who are between the undergraduates that we might really agree on and the graduate students who fall into many of the problems that you very nicely said. I mean, I'm curious, just to have a dialogue about it, what's your reaction to that? Does that tripartite framework resonate with you, or?
You used to be able to give people advice, knowledge, right? That's or referral. And now it's a real ethical question about whether or not you can protect or give people tools. Right?
Yeah.
Young people tend to be optimistic. And optimism is critical for an investment. Even here for
yeah.
I work in labor law, one of the areas I work on. Not really a lot of PhD applications coming into Hong Kong to work on labor law.
Yeah.
And then I get other people asking me questions like, I have a labor law scholar who's interested in the subject. Should they add not just China as like their core competency, like the old area studies model, but they're doing a dissertation. Should they add China as one of their comparative examples?
Yeah.
What are they going to be able to do? Is it worthwhile for them to add that as opposed to another position? So I find myself struggling with what the ethical implications are simply because I don't want to put people in positions.
Yeah.
That's a really significant change. The younger they are, right? That's really people advice on things that for longitudinal. At the same time, if that pipeline breaks down, longitudinal stuff.
Exactly.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
like job curiosity. Job systems, I want to talk about everyone they've known for like the last 40 years from a very long period of time. His students built upon that. We all built upon that network. As that repeats, right, it becomes even more difficult to tell someone there's going to be a community of people.
Yeah.
That you can have these conversations. That really sort of.
Yeah. These are fantastic points. I have a lot of respect for that perspective. And I think you've stated it really eloquently. Very, very difficult. To my mind, if again we're thinking of that early 1980s period as the model, the point may not be so much to like go back to fifth year on everything, but at least to preserve an edifice that we can kind of build on incrementally. I think we are in serious danger, and have been in the last couple of years, of losing the edifice entirely, of just not, people in Washington talk about decoupling that reaches beyond economic decoupling and gets to even like, academic decoupling. I think that's a very, very real risk. And then if that were to happen, even getting to these more high order questions that we're talking about becomes even harder down the road. So I think the best that I can see is let's at least try to preserve some degree of edifice, understanding that some of the kinds of issues you're talking about are not going to be solvable right now. But maybe over time, if we preserve the edifice and keep building on it, we can get back to a point where we are kind of comfortable pushing the line in the ways that some of your examples are suggesting. That to me is the game right now. It's preserving something that is not exactly what we had before, but it's still something we can build on and kind of push the line on. And it sounds so moderate, it almost sounds like it's not a big enough deal. But when you think about the fact that it is genuinely at risk, then it becomes, it becomes more of a substantial thing. So you say, okay, are we going to be able to advise the grad student who wants to do really cutting edge work on labor law in China to just kind of go there and figure it out? Probably not. But at least for now, preserve all the different, I think again of my interaction with Jiangping when I was 20, like there were so many layers that got to that point where that was even a plausible thing for me to be in a position where I had this conversation with him. And maybe we can't preserve all of those layers, but let's at least keep some of those layers for now, and then hopefully build more layers. That's the perspective that I'm arguing for. So it is a moderate vision in the end, but not an insignificant one because of how much risk there is to losing the whole game.
Professor Li Cheng has a question.
And the whole time I've been curious because I'm very, I'm very curious about Professor Li Cheng's position on all this.
That is insightful. Following for acting much here, explanation, that, and also really this is quite inspiring. I think it's certainly reflect the part of this future. I think that if U.S. and China avoid the succession trap, avoid a major war, not because of economic ties, not because of but not because of 4 decades long education. Eventually. Now, despite that comes things, part of the deeply worried, or do you talk about academic recovery? I think it's like very high possibility to have. Now, if a Republican win, even without a Republican win, it's also very problematic. That I will tell you why. First of all, look at the Gallagher Committee. It basically, monthly, sometimes weekly, inform universities stop education exchange with China.
Sure.
If you do not, you will not receive funding from DOD, from energy, from agriculture, name it. So under that kind of pressure, university have to, to look at what's more important. Secondly, that you mentioned about Hong Kong is unique, but many people in the U.S., even executive branch may not take that view. They already identify Hong Kong with mainland China. But even a candidate, Trump, actually, remember in October 2017, he vetoed that White House decision. This is leaked to the Financial Times. That they want to end the education exchanges, no longer accept Chinese students into that story. He vetoed. But now, he said, when he becomes president second term, he will go along with the Michael Pompeo proposal in his final year to ban the Chinese Communist Party and their relatives come to the United States. So what that means is enough for everything. Now, this is one level. Another level, we talk about sending students to China, but American low middle class could not afford this kind of financial aid, financial situation send their children, besides certain political reasons and other reasons. American foundations are not willing to put that money in that kind of thing. So this is another layer of that. Even during Obama, Hillary Clinton was going to be strong. We have difficulty to get money, but now in far worse. The third one is even the most important one. I mean, I saw the statistics. There's only 28,000 American students study Chinese in university. 28,000 Chinese. There's 220 million people studying English. So that's hopeless. With the great power United States, only 28,000 study Chinese language. This is deeper, much deeper just about China. We're not ready. We in this case, the United States, not ready to deal with this kind of real challenge. So that's my question. Do you think my optimism, my pessimistic view? I mean, that's how to reconcile this. Now, but I have another, if I may, I have another.
Please.
About Chinese. Looking back for China's 2014 NGO laws, do you think it's a mistake? China adopted law. Now, of course, I explain more on the U.S. like confidence and insecure and etc. But China at that time, when adopted that law, also kind of, it's not a good idea for this kind of exchanges and make a lot of people very worrisome to fear. So your comment, how important is that the NGO law affect the
Very deep, very, very, very important points. Let me start with one broad optimistic observation. And then I'll go back to each of the things. So one data point that gives me a lot of optimism. For all the reasons you mentioned, this particular moment is very difficult. And in a lot of ways, the 1980s, 1990s were much easier. But there are so many people in Chinese institutions, academic institutions, some of them are represented even in this room, who are the people in the next cohort of different types of law schools, schools of government, economic department, sociology department, political science departments, all have training abroad. All are networked in academic communities abroad, including the United States. That landscape just did not exist in the 1980s. So as much as the 1980s, 1990s was, this much more open period, like that didn't exist. Like that level of sort of sophistication broadly throughout. And so just that one variable is the kind of thing that I think can give me optimism that, there's something there that, I'll just, because I've posted this on, Twitter the other day, there's this photo of the Department of Politics at Peking University in 1949. And there's like 6 people in the photo. And they include Wang Tieya and Gong Xiangrui and Qian Duansheng and Zhao Baoshu and some others. I won't go into the history of all of them. If you're interested, you can find my Twitter post and kind of look at it. But, each of those people at that moment in that photo had just come back to Beijing after having studied abroad. Each of those people in the years after that photo had incredible suffering. And each of those people is now incredibly venerated in China today, and their students and their students are. So like these are deep dynamics and that's not to say that I hope everyone, is okay with suffering for a while, like obviously better not, but like, I just think that there's a depth to what the exchanges of the past have wrought that is going to be there. But all the dynamics that you just talked about are hugely problematic, and especially thinking about on the U.S. side first and the Chinese side. On the U.S. side, so I think you could break down your 2 points into like the political atmosphere and then the logistical atmosphere. They're both real, right? So the concern from the select committee, I think a lot of universities are conscious of that, and the wider political discourse that the select committee represents. And on the logistical side, the expense of coming to China and all of that, obviously, it will only work if foundations were to take it seriously and to put money into it, and potentially the government as well, right? Like, so the Fulbright program famously was canceled in the Trump administration, and again, this goes to, I'm very happy that U.S. policymakers are saying the right word now, but if they really mean it, if they really mean that it's in America's national interest to better have to students come here, then they should bring the Fulbright back. Like, why not? Like, why you can't say, oh yeah, we really want American students to come back to China and still not change the travel warning and still not have the Fulbright and not have the Peace Corps and any of that stuff. Like, someone has to, at some point, either you mean it or you don't, right? So those are things that are necessary. And if I have any optimism about that overall picture, that set of logistical issues and the set of political issues, is that there is some pushback right now. I think if we went back 3 or 4 years ago, there was no pushback. And part of the reason there's pushback is because many academics, including myself, became kind of mobilized to say, wait a second, if we don't try to find effective ways of pushing back, we're just going to lose the entire environment that we're operating within. So at least there's the positive stories that there's some pushback, and how it plays out is going to be, I think, a big story going forward, because as you said, this has been an incredibly important component of U.S.-China relations. And so, again, I genuinely believe like any American experts on China should be thinking in terms of how can we be effective in pushing back on those sets of dynamics. In terms of the Chinese dynamic, I think it's encouraging that there have been people like Jia Qingguo, who at the height of the pandemic took his position at the CPPCC and put forward this idea that we have to preserve the landscape of scholarly exchange, right? Like, that was, I think, an important thing that happened at that time. And there are, I think, more people who are willing to speak in those terms now that there's the rhetoric from the top. But there has to be a grappling with the consequences of things like the foreign NGO law. That I think goes to the point that I made during my presentation of, if the Chinese side is serious about exchange, it has to be true academic exchange. It can't be a managed exchange where we only talk to approved people on approved topics. And so the complexities of the foreign NGO law and all the downstream effects and things that are maybe not specifically related to the foreign NGO law, but are part of the same environment, things like having to, get the foreign visiting professors, or a foreign person wants to give a lecture, you have to get that approved, months and months, if not a year in advance, all of those kinds of things. That is, if the Chinese side is really truly cares about exchange, they just can't. You can't keep that. You can't keep those kinds of restrictions, which are the kinds of things that make the Americans not want to come, right? If you tell the Americans, like, you're gonna have to go through all these processes, you want to, like, attend a meeting, a scholarly meeting in China, they're going to have to go through all these approvals to have it turn into an international conference because there's one person foreign. That landscape has to change. None of this is preordained to work. My only, I think, closely held belief is that it will not change if we don't put some pressure on, right? On both sides. like if we just retreat to where these dynamics would naturally put us, it's not going to change on its own. It's only going to get more and more solidified. So doesn't mean if we try it's going to work, but if we don't try, it's definitely not going to work for all the reasons you set out.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. I'm going to give Angela the last question and give you 1 minute to.
Sure. What is the KPI?
You heard of KPI?
A little bit, but I kind of forget exactly.
Key performance indicator.
Oh, key performance indicator.
Very popular term in Hong Kong. As in
That is
China.
You know, I think the KPI is not to change policy. That is too high of a bar. So there's not going to be a straight line. But I think that if we can demonstrate that we have gotten the perspectives that have honed through the project into the discourse in a more robust way, and that includes the degree to which the policy papers are read, where they're published, the degree to which people pay attention to the media products, the degree to which policymakers listen to us. Those are all things that we can point to as indicators. But none of this is going to, I think, result in a very clear, it's not, the point here is not to directly change any policy. The point here is just to include in the conversation a wider range of perspectives that are rooted in expertise. If we can show that we've done that, I think that's a contribution. That's something that is missing right now, and I'd be very happy with that. But I don't know if that would satisfy the more stringent KPI requirements here in Hong Kong.
Okay, so with that, let's conclude our talk, and let's thank Nathan again for this wonderful conversation.
And thank you. These were all, including the KPI question, very, very provocative and thought-provoking. And I feel that I have to sit down and keep reflecting on the conversation today and continue to sharpen my own thinking about these issues on the basis of it.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see many of you in future CCPL events. Thank you.